So what am I going to do today? I'm going to talk a little bit about what evidence-based practice is, where it comes from. I'm going to talk a bit about some recent developments in this area. What do we actually mean by evidence? Do we have the evidence? Because it's easy to say evidence-based practice, but some people say in education, maybe we do not have that evidence at all. I'm going to talk about some challenges and make some little suggestions about maybe where we can go next. So I'm going to start off by kind of talking a bit about what evidence-based practice is. And one of the things that we have to remember, of course, is that the origins of the terminology come very much from the medical field. This morning I was at a session in which we heard about teacher education in Norway, and that was described at one point as evidence-informed clinical teacher education. And I thought, that is interesting, because we have here the word clinical, which clearly points to that kind of influence of the medical practice on sort of evidence-based and evidence-informed approaches. And so when you look actually at where this comes from, you can see a number of definitions of evidence-based practice in education. So this is kind of one of the classic definitions that comes from medicine. And what you can see, it is about using evidence to make decisions about the care of individual patients. Sounds quite straightforward, but of course it's much less straightforward than it sounds, because sometimes in education we think, in medicine they have it easy because they have this very strong science, so there's always kind of quite a clear decision to be made. Well, that's not actually true at all when you look at how medical science really works. Doctors also, just like teachers, have to make a lot of decisions on the hoof based on kind of partial evidence. Sometimes the evidence is less strong than we think, so also they confront some of similar problems to us. Now, a number of years, you can see this definition is from 1996. Around 9 years later, there was a big kind of meeting to discuss what evidence-based practice in medicine was, and they came to this statement, the Sicily statement. The meeting was in Sicily, you will not be surprised to hear. Now, what's interesting here is that you can actually see a bit of a shift compared to that previous definition I showed you, because some things remain, so you use the best possible evidence to make decisions, but a big difference, those decisions should be made by those receiving care. So whereas in the previous definition, the one 9 years older, you kind of saw that there was sort of an emphasis on the professionals making the decisions, here you can actually see decisions made by those receiving care, obviously with the knowledge and support provided by the medical professions. So there's a much more central role for the actual patient. Now, that's interesting, I think, also for us in education, because sometimes when we look at evidence-based practice, we forget that bit of it. So actually it is not we who should be saying, schools, teachers do this. It is about schools and teachers taking decisions based on evidence that we support them with. And that's something I will come back to later. So in education, maybe sometimes our definitions are a little bit simpler. This is an example of it. Practices that are shown through to be effective through high-quality research, and what they say here is, what does effective mean? That means meaningfully improving student outcomes. Now, there are a lot of positives to that. Of course, education is about improving student outcomes. It should be. Of course, we want to use high-quality research, but there are clearly also questions to be asked around this type of definition. Firstly, what outcomes? There are, of course, multiple outcomes that we as educators want. There are multiple outcomes that parents want. There are multiple outcomes that society wants. And those sometimes are conflicting and contested. So therefore, what is the evidence around the particular outcome that we are looking for is what we need to decide on. And when we look at the evidence base in education, of course, you see that there's a lot more evidence in certain areas than others, which I'll come back to later. Second big question there is high-quality research. What does high-quality research mean? Again, that's something that there is quite a bit of discussion about, and another thing I will come back to in a moment. So you can see the origins of evidence-based practice lie very much in the medical field. We have taken that, and that's not just true of education. As you saw earlier, in my school, we also do social work, we also do criminology, and those fields also use kind of evidence-based practice approaches. Similarly, they have taken on that language and they have taken on that thinking around, yes, we need to make that link between research and practice, theory and research, etc. So that's obviously been quite a growing movement over recent years. So we have seen a big growth in kind of evidence-based practice, and you can see that that is both a bottom-up movement driven by educators and researchers. So you can see there's been a real movement towards teachers coming together in teach meets, in conferences, where they discuss research, where they discuss their own practitioner research, etc., which is really interesting. You have seen, certainly a while ago, a kind of proliferation of kind of teacher bloggers who write often about their view of the evidence in education. There is an active kind of evidence-based grouping of and discussion on what is now known as X rather than Twitter. Thank you, Elon Musk. And of course, we have conferences. We see here the slogan of EAPRIL, where research and practice in education meet. So obviously, here is one example of where we try to make that connection. And there are, of course, other conferences as well. I say bottom-up, but there is, of course, also, in many countries, institutional support for evidence-based policy and practice. Politicians often say they are doing evidence-based policy. The extent to which that is actually the case is variable, I would say, and I will come back to that one a bit later as well. But certainly, in a number of places, they have tried to put in place some supportive mechanisms. In England, for example, the Education Endowment Foundation gets quite significant government support for their work in both conducting evaluations and trying to collect evidence themselves in that way, especially through RCTs, and in summarizing the evidence that exists. And again here, you can see a little bit the influence of the medical field coming through, because what two things does EEF concentrate on? Firstly, that is randomized controlled trials, similar to the classical medical research model, and evidence syntheses. And again, you see that there is a big movement in evidence-based practice in education to kind of do these evidence-based syntheses. So again, you see that influence. Oh, that's obviously not just the case in England, that's in many other countries. There are also similar initiatives, in the Netherlands, for example, but also EU-wide. An interesting thing to look at is the EU Learning Lab, where the European Union tries to collate various bits of evidence around learning and education. In a previous job, I worked for the English inspection called Ofsted, where I was head of the research and evaluation function, and we tried to bring in some evidence-based practice there. And of course, professional bodies, trade unions, teacher organizations, general teaching council, those kind of organizations also often play a role in that. So there are a variety of organizations and people who are supporting this movement towards evidence-based practice, which is great, because I do think evidence-based practice is a good idea. However, we do have a question here, which is, what about the name evidence-based? There has been quite a lot of discussion, should we call it evidence-based or evidence-informed? Why do we make that distinction? Precisely because if we call it evidence-based, it is often seen as something that comes top-down. I apply the evidence that is given to me in my classroom, whereas in evidence-informed, the emphasis is much more on the professional, the teacher, making decisions, her or himself, based on what kind of evidence is available. Now, as you will see, actually, when you go back to that Sicily Declaration, which I showed you earlier, that actually corresponds very closely with the kind of principle of evidence-informed. So I'm very happy with the term evidence-informed, I have no problem with it, but actually when you go back to some of the medical origins of evidence-based practice, it does assume that kind of professional decision-making, that idea that the professional takes the evidence and shapes it in ways that are going to suit their individual context, their classroom, etc. Okay, so we are saying we want to do some evidence-based practice. But of course, that means we need to have evidence. Do we have that evidence is our first question. And what do we mean by evidence? Now, traditionally, and certainly when you look at the sort of evidence-based practice movement in the medical field, we often end up with this, which is called the evidence pyramid. And what that tries to do is basically classify different types of research by their rigor, validity, reliability. And you can see that at the bottom of the pyramid, you can see expert opinion, which is seen in this model as being least valid, followed by kind of more qualitative methods. And at the top of the pyramid, you can see randomized controlled trials and systematic reviews. And remember, I said earlier, when they set up the Education Endowment Foundation in England, what did they do? Randomized controlled trials and systematic reviews. So they are, in this model, seen as what they call the gold standard, with randomized controlled trials being seen as the most kind of rigorous way of, in particular, looking at causality in research, whereas systematic reviews are seen as the most valid way of collating the evidence from those randomized controlled trials. And obviously, the most sort of what you could statistical way of doing that is through meta-analysis. However, I think that this pyramid has many problems with it when we want to employ evidence-based practice in education. Firstly, of course, it is a little bit of a strange idea to say we have a pyramid that is hierarchical. Because if I'm actually building a pyramid, then the bit that I am going to find most important is the bottom bit, because if I take that away, then my whole pyramid will come crashing down. So this in itself is a little bit of a problem when we look at something like that. Secondly, of course, and more substantially, firstly, it is about what we want to find out. So in the English expression, it is horses for courses, and it depends what our question is, whether or not a particular method is going to be the most useful. There are many things that we cannot sensibly do a randomized controlled trial of. There are also many things we cannot ethically do a randomized control trial of, because let us not forget that our principle in research, in education and elsewhere is do no harm, and therefore sometimes by assigning pupils to particular groups, we may be disadvantaging a group of pupils, or we may be doing things that could be potentially harmful to them. So there are things which are really ethically difficult as well. Also, can be quite difficult. There is quite an important group of people in education who do not particularly like their children to be randomly assigned, and they are called parents. So you could run into some significant opposition sometimes when you try to do this. Also, of course, let us not forget that there is actually a bit of an issue with saying the top two in this pyramid are are valid and reliable. Systematic reviews, and in particular meta-analysis, also have many problems in terms of reliability and validity. For example, the fact that they often combine very different things. I was looking, and I presented a bit on that yesterday, at various meta-analyses around the relationship between attainment and motivation. Now, one of the interesting things that you will see is that there are about 12 different ways in which motivation is conceptualized and measured. So therefore, what are we actually comparing in those different studies? That's a problem. Also, of course, randomized controlled trials have a problem in educational research because of the gap between research and practice that you can then create. The best randomized controlled trials happen in the most controlled possible circumstances. That's why we've got laboratories. That's ideal from a research perspective because you can make sure that there are no extraneous variables that are influencing the experiment that you are doing. Of course, the problem that we have is that a classroom is not quite as controlled an environment as a laboratory, which those of you who have been in one as either teacher or pupil will probably recall. And therefore, that translation from that controlled environment into that classroom environment is not unproblematic, which means that if we are going to do that, we are actually going to have an intermediate step between doing a randomized controlled trial and actually adapting that to classroom practice and seeing whether it works in an actual classroom. So there are some issues with that. So I would say we do need to take a sufficiently broad view of what evidence is and what actually we are going to use. Of course, another question is, do we actually have enough evidence in the first place in education? And Dylan William, obviously one of the leading educational researchers internationally, has said the following about education research: everything works somewhere, but nothing works everywhere. If that's true, that's a big problem for us, because how can we use evidence-based practice if all the evidence we have is, well, something will work here, but not there, something else will work there and not here? Then we cannot really do very much. But, I mean, I would say, William, I maybe don't fully agree with you, because we have plenty of examples of things that don't work. Think, for example, if we try to eat soup with a fork, does that work? No, I would say not. However, Dylan William could come back to me and say, well, actually, Muijs, we can eat soup with a fork. There is a way of doing that. So I am right. Everything works somewhere. But, of course, that is true, but some things do work better than others. And that's also what we do see in education. It's true that even the best evidence-based practice doesn't work everywhere. It's true that we can usually find some evidence of something that works. I will give you a typical example of that. In Northern Ireland, we have a selective secondary education system where kids go either into a grammar school, that is a preparation for higher education, or not, based on some tests at the end of primary school. And we know from much research that that doesn't have a very positive impact, especially not on equality in education. Yet you can always find somebody who will tell you, but my uncle Freddie, he came from a working class background, he went to a grammar school, and now he is the Minister of Education or something like that. So you can find examples, but the thing is, what we are talking about is the probability of things that are going to work. So when we use evidence-based practice, we are increasing the likelihood that what we do is going to work. It's not a guarantee, but it's likely to work better. So I like to compare that a little bit with betting. So say I wanted to place a bet on a football game between, say, Real Madrid and Belfast Crusaders. What I can do, of course, it is possible that Belfast will win that game. You never know. Football is unpredictable. However, to increase and maximize my probability of getting my money back, I'd probably better put my bet on Real Madrid instead. So that's what we're kind of talking about. We are not guaranteeing, but we are increasing our probability of success. So do we have evidence? Well, yes, we do have evidence in education. It would be a bit disappointing if after, 150 years or so of educational research, we didn't know anything. And luckily, that is not true. We have accumulative evidence in a whole number of areas. I just have some examples here, and I will not go on about them too long because I know you want to have lunch at some point. But some examples that we know of is research on how we can teach children to read. That's very strong. We have growing evidence of how we learn from cognitive science. There's 50 years of research on effective teaching and pedagogy. We have growing research on self-regulation, very strong research based there, classroom climate, etc. So, for example, when you look at reading, we know of the importance of combining word recognition and language comprehension. So you need both those aspects combined if you are going to teach your children to read, and we have a lot of evidence on that. We know that if we want to make sure that pupils retain knowledge in their long-term memory, we have to ensure that we don't overload their working memory, that we use rehearsal and retrieval to connect information from the long-term memory to new information in our short-term memory, and so on. So we have plenty of information of those things. We have plenty of information on effective teaching. This is what we call the three-factor model, which was developed by German researchers, Klima, Baumann, Pretorius, etc. And there is quite a consensus that these things matter to effective teaching in classrooms. I mean, I think if you read them, you're probably not going to go, oh, none of these things is important. So we have got a growing consensus. Of course, what you can see in something like this is there's a lot of detail underneath that needs working out. So if we are saying, for example, positive relationships in the classroom, of course that's important, we know that. But what does that mean and how do we do that? So there is still a big step to make there, which also is one of the issues with educational research sometimes that can be quite at a general level. Metacognition, I did a review of that with my colleague from Southampton University, Christian Bockhover. Fantastic research base on that. You can read the review on the website of the Education Endowment Foundation, which I mentioned earlier. But again, we know quite a lot about how to promote that. But the problem is our evidence base is quite variable depending on what area we are looking at. So, for example, while we have a lot of research in subjects like mathematics, science, English, home language, etc., there are subjects that we have much less research on. In this setting, I would have to mention religious education, for example, as one area where we have much less rigorous research on, for example, the didactics of how that works. So there are differences between subjects. There's also differences between contexts. We have, again, this problem that we have in research across the board, which is that so much more of our research comes from what are known as weird countries, so Western, developed countries, and we sometimes then say, okay, we have this research, so now let's go to Indonesia and do the same things there. But of course, that's not necessarily going to work because those contexts are different, those cultures are different, etc. We have this big translation issue. So the fact that something has worked in a particular school certainly I've mentioned already the problem of transferring from the laboratory to the classroom, that's a big one, but also if we, of course, do research in a particular country, for example, the US, we have a lot of research in the US, does that translate in the same way to a classroom in Northern Ireland, in Sweden, in Netherlands, or whatever? Well, not necessarily, because again, cultures are different, the way teachers are trained and developed are different, how we select teachers is different. So again, we have that translation to make. And this is also why I stressed at the beginning this importance of it is the user, the teacher, who creates evidence-based practice by taking the best evidence and adapting that to her or his classroom and making a decision, do we have the right conditions in place to do that? Because, of course, again, if we are going to introduce evidence-based practice, we need to make sure that that's actually, that the school that we are introducing, that it is actually ready for this particular practice. Do we have, for example, teachers who are sufficiently aware of, I don't know, special educational needs to be able to create that inclusive environment, which is where we all want to end up with? That's not something that we can always assume. Do we even have enough teachers to do a particular intervention? We know one of the big problems that is facing education across the world is teacher shortages, teacher retention, teacher recruitment. And now it's all very well to say I am going to do a great new intervention in foreign languages teaching in this school, but if actually what is happening is the person teaching the foreign languages is the sports teacher who just happens to know a little bit of German, then it is unlikely that my intervention is going to be successful because we do not have the right conditions in place. So we need to think about that. But again, and to repeat what I said earlier, I do think we need to engage with evidence-based practice because of the way it actually really does increase the probability that we are going to achieve what we want to achieve. So, to paraphrase the famous country singer Loretta Lynn, I feel we have come a long way in terms of developing an evidence-based approach in education. By the way, a quick cultural note that interested me very much when I came to Northern Ireland is the tremendous popularity of country music here. Maybe some of you went to the pub yesterday and heard some traditional Irish music. Well, the other music that is apparently for some reason very popular in this country, so hence my reference to Loretta Lynn. But we have done well, I think, so far. However, we still have a big way to go. Because firstly, we see that though we have evidence in many areas, it is frequently not used. Or even things that we know from the evidence don't work are still being used. Here is an example. We have now got plenty of evidence that the concept of adapting teaching to pupils' learning styles is an ineffective practice and is not based on any solid research. Yet, what do I see in the Northern Ireland primary curriculum? We need to use approaches that adapt to pupils' learning styles. What do I see in civil service learning? So that's the training that all civil servants in the UK receive. We need to adapt to people's learning styles. And the final one is coming from a school website. Obviously, I'm not going to tell you which school that is. But you see, things that we know don't work still keep cropping up. Similarly, there's a lot of evidence that we know about that is ignored by policy. I spoke earlier about grammar schools here in Northern Ireland. Of course, we've got all that evidence that shows that early selection and streaming leads to greater educational inequality. Hello, colleagues from the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, etc. But still, all those systems, like Northern Ireland, don't take that research into account. Also, an example for us here, for everybody from the UK in particular, there is no evidence whatsoever that wearing a school uniform improves the behavior of pupils. But the amount of time that I have said that to people and just go, oh, you're wrong, but I don't know. But believe me, having been to many schools in England, Wales, Northern Ireland, pupils can misbehave when they're wearing a school uniform. So we have a lot of evidence, but often it's still, the dissemination and use of that is still variable. So that's a challenge for us. So we need to kind of keep working with educators, with schools, and particularly kind of co-producing professional development that can bring that evidence out there and bring that into practice. Another challenge is around how we use the evidence. So are we using all the evidence? Are we susceptible to new myths, like the myths of learning style? What about lethal mutations of the evidence? What about changes? So all of those things are challenges. One of those things that we see is that we sometimes are selective in the use of evidence. So I talked a bit earlier about the influence of cognitive science, a very important, very good thing. And that's obviously led to a lot of work on memory, on the importance of knowledge, on cognitive load, etc. But there is, of course, a lot more research in this area around learning. And sometimes, for example, we ignore all the research on the importance of emotion to pupil learning. So we need to make sure that we don't just like selectively cherry pick bits of a certain field of research, but actually look at the fullness of it. Second one is new myths. New myths can always grow. And we need to be careful that we don't just let that happen. And again, I can give you a kind of personal example of that. It's related again to the presentation I gave yesterday on the relationship between motivation and attainment. So a while ago, with my colleague David Reynolds, I wrote a book called Effective Teaching, Evidence and Practice. And in that book, I cited some research on the relationship between pupil attainment and their self-concept. And I said there's a reciprocal relationship between attainment and self-concept, but the impact of attainment on our self-concept is greater than the impact of self-concept on attainment. That's quite a lot of studies show that. However, a number of years later, I attend conferences, and suddenly that message has kind of morphed into attainment influences motivation, and motivation doesn't influence attainment, and then my name is underneath it. So sometimes new myths grow up, and that's of course not correct. It is a reciprocal relationship. So that danger exists also in evidence-based practice, and Christian gave a number of useful tips, I think, to look at that as practitioners. So we do need to follow up the sources, so not just because somebody's name is cited does that actually mean that they have really said that. We need to be careful always with oversimplification, and that's very easily done and something that we see often in the way that research is translation. And of course, and this is actually one of the key things also that we know from looking at the whole area of research, which is obviously very unfortunately flourishing at the moment, which is around the whole area of fake news and conspiracy theories, etc., that if there is a myth and if something is wrong, if you just say, no, you're wrong, COVID does exist, global warming does exist, that person will just dismiss you. So you do need to present the compelling evidence that what you are saying can actually replace that erroneous view that exists. It's not easy to do, because one of the things that we know is that we hold quite strongly to our existing beliefs, and what we will first try and do is take new evidence and try and mold that to support our existing beliefs rather than to move beyond that. So that's a process that takes time, it's a process that is difficult, but it's a process we really, really do need to engage with, especially in the current period when there is so much kind of false information out there and it's having so much influence. Also, be cautious about developing policy based on new claims. What you see, and again, this is a problem with kind of how our media ecosystem works, is that something new and exciting gets a lot of publicity. But sometimes those things are based on one study, but because that study is sort of innovative and interesting, that gets a massive amount of publicity and starts to influence what people do. So an example of that is this. What am I doing here? This is a power stance. And what does the power stance do? If I go into a power stance before I present, that's going to make me feel more confident, more capable, and therefore I'm going to do a better job. So this was, you are laughing, but this was something that was very popular around 10 years ago and was influential. There were some very interesting photographs of the UK government at the time and all doing these stances. So those things have influence. Obviously, since then, that study has been kind of debunked because it doesn't replicate, and that's the problem with these novel things. They often don't replicate, but they can be particularly influential. So, lethal mutations. We can take research that is good, and it can sort of turn into a wee monster. So, I'll give you an example. Retrieval practice. We know retrieval practice is a highly valuable thing to do. We know that it helps us retain information. We know that helps us to connect information to new information, etc. Yet, because we know that, we sometimes see things like this, and this again, it comes from a real example, and I'm not here to criticize people, so I'm just putting it up there. Start all lessons with retrieval of information from the previous lesson. So somebody is taking the idea that is absolutely correct, that retrieval practice is a good thing to do, and said, therefore, we have to do it at the start of every lesson. Now, that's a bit of a nonsense, because there is no evidence that all lessons should follow the same structure. A lesson is part of a sequence of lessons on a particular topic, and within that sequence we are going to have to do different things at different times. So to say every lesson has to do this, that doesn't work. There was a fantastic example of this when I first moved to England from Belgium in around 1997. There was something called the National Literacy Strategy. And that was kind of intended to help primary teachers teach literacy. And in the booklets there was a little clock. And the clock said, first 5 minutes of the lesson, you start with a warm-up activity. Then the next 15, I can't remember the exact numbers, next 15 minutes you give your direct instruction. Then 25 minutes you do practice. And then you have your plenary at the end for 5 or 10 minutes. And every lesson was supposed to be like that. Now, that's another good example of a lethal mutation. There are things in there which we know are good. It's good to set out your objectives. It's good to repeat what pupils have learned. But the idea that we do that every time, that's obviously not helpful. So, evidence changes. That's another thing. Sometimes we look at evidence as a kind of fixed entity. But of course, it's not a fixed entity. It's a changeable entity. We are continuously doing new research, and therefore we need to be open to those changes. Because if we don't do that, look, for example, at something like learning, we do not believe from our new evidence the same things about learning as we did in 1966, for example. So we need to make sure that also with the things that we now believe, we are open to changes to those things. So we need to question our own assumptions. Finally, there is a danger of politicization of research and evidence. What do I mean with that? Is that sometimes politicians take particular bits of the evidence, and that then becomes part of the political debate. And what then happens is that evidence becomes subject to the vagaries of political change. So because something becomes political, when the government changed, and governments always change at some point in a democracy, then everything will be thrown out from the previous government, the new government will bring in whatever they believe, and therefore we never get a cumulative evidence-based policy, rather we get a seesaw of different policies. So we need to, again, be careful that we do not fall into the trap of overly politicizing research and hanging on to particular politicians. And what I can give you, again, an example. I mean, I've worked in England for many years, and what you can see there is that a number of policies, some evidence-based, some not, were promoted by the current still government. That government is likely to disappear, and a lot of those policies will then change. That will mean that some things that are positive about what has been done in the last 10 years will disappear. That's what happened in 2010 when the previous government came into power. That's an issue. Luckily, in Northern Ireland, we do not have that issue so much, because A, we do not have a government, and B, having read all the party programs, they are not so strong on education, which is probably just as well, because otherwise education policy would also become just another way of telling whether somebody is Protestant or Catholic, which is the favorite hobby of people in Northern Ireland. Beware of kind of that approach. So, to finish off, because I promised I would only speak for 45 minutes, there is a lot of evidence out there, I think. I think there's still a big job to do to work with practitioners and policymakers to make sure that they are aware of the best evidence and then can make an informed decision about what evidence they are going to use in their own classroom. So I think we need to use what we know, but we need to be critical, we need to be credible in the way that we present information, and I think if we do that, we can kind of come into a positive relationship between high-quality research, high-quality dissemination and co-construction, using what we know about effective professional development, because we've got a lot of research in that area as well, but we don't always use it ourselves, and then get educational and political buy-in. That's all I wanted to say, and I think we have some time for questions.
Thank you so much. Okay, now we have time for questions and comments.
Okay. Thank you very much for your interesting keynote. I couldn't follow, maybe I misunderstood what you were saying about, and if you were advocating about the learning styles, but that is actually outdated for many years already by changing evidence. But that's not actually my question is about. You were having another statement about that evidence needs to be translated into schools and classroom practice. But is that not very related to the way in cognitive learning science research is done? And is that not less a problem in, for instance, action research, practitioner research, practice-based research, research practitioner partnership research? What is your opinion about that, or your perspective?
Okay, so I'm first just going back to your first point. I couldn't agree more that the learning styles research has been debunked and is outdated, and I was kind of giving examples of where it is still used today in policy documents. In relation to this issue of translation, yes, I mean, obviously any kind of lab-based approach, which most of cognitive science is, has a greater gap towards the classroom that needs to be bridged if we are going to use that. So what we then need to do is to develop other studies that actually try and use those principles in real classrooms to see how and when it works. Is that less of a problem with other types of research? Yes, obviously when you are talking about, say, co-production, practitioner research, you are in that classroom, so that immediate translation issue is not there. Of course, where we then get sometimes a problem is how do we go from that classroom, or those relatively small number of classrooms where we've done the research, to a more broader application of that principle. So you get almost the opposite problem, which is the problem of generalizability. But you're absolutely right that where we do practitioner research, of course, that's immediately relevant to the classroom. But it's not necessarily relevant to the classroom in the country next door. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah. Yes, yes, no, that is about awareness. Yes, absolutely.
Some more questions, and also there. Here.
Yeah, I'm interested in this role of the professional unions and trade, because I know that there are differences in different systems, and I think it could be a way to make evidence-based practice more bottom-up if they are required, like a code of conduct, which is not the case in Sweden, for instance. But I know that in Scotland, for instance, they are more into that. So I wonder if you could speak more about this.
So I think there is great potential, obviously, for working with teacher unions, for example, on both developing and disseminating evidence-based practice. I think you are right to say that the extent to which that happens differs significantly between countries, between unions, etc. I mean, what I would say is probably worth doing is engaging with them and trying to get them interested in what you have done, what your research is saying. Of course, what goes for unions, and that goes for any engagement with policymakers, is that you kind of, to influence them, have to work a little bit with the grain. So you will not get a union to work with you if your research says, actually, we can just replace teachers with AI robots or something like that. And similarly, you will not get a conservative politician to work with you if you say, actually, what we need to do is stop selective education and make sure that we have comprehensivization. So I think there's great potential there. I think it's very much worth engaging with unions, but obviously it's worth kind of looking at what are their interests and what are their priorities and seeing, okay, how does my work fit in what they actually already want to do?
And here's one, please.
Hello, working here. Thank you very much for the presentation. More questions than answers, and this is your job probably. So I have a specific comment, and I also wanted to ask you advice. So you referred to the existence of a structured recommendation for the structured lesson plan in the past. What do you think, how this the diversity in how you plan lessons in every single day, how this can work when we have more inclusive classrooms where children with special education needs are mixed with other children, and those with special education needs are actually recommended to have structured routine. So how this can work for them?
Okay, so I'm going to say a couple of things there. Firstly, I am not an expert in special educational needs, so I don't think it would be sensible for me to sort of answer your question in terms of this is what you should do with pupils with special educational needs, and I'm not going to do that. What I would say is that in terms of kind of heterogeneous classrooms, that kind of doesn't necessarily change the overall picture, which is that I think whereas structure is obviously important and every lesson has some type of structure, what I'm trying to say is that that structure should not necessarily be the same lesson after lesson, because that will depend a little bit where you are in teaching a particular topic. So for example, if you are teaching a new topic, you may want to start in the first lesson by maybe some activities that retrieve what knowledge they already have, that look at what they may have experienced and their personal interests, then present some new information. But as you go through that process of developing the understanding of that new topic, obviously you are going to then have to practice it, you are going to then have to let them explore it further. So you are going to have different phases in going through that learning. So therefore the idea that every lesson has to be this, that doesn't really work so well. Also when we look at how we learn, it is, for example, important that we try to consolidate our knowledge through practice and through retrieval. So sometimes if you look at, say, those ideas of this is the structure of a lesson, it will sort of penalize you if, say, I went into your lesson and what I see is the pupils all practicing in a workbook, because then I'm coming in with my observation schedule and say interaction between teachers and students, where is that? Clear explanation of the teacher, where is that? But actually that may be exactly the right thing to do at that particular moment in terms of consolidating the understanding of those pupils. So, so that's kind of would be, but I'm not going to advise you specifically on special needs education.
Thank you very much. And so now I just wanted to ask your insights, suggestions. So we have a project on the effect, long-term effect of school absenteeism on educational attainment and labor market outcomes. We finished this project. Now the task is to disseminate the research, knowledge exchange. How can we deliver message to different stakeholders? Who are those stakeholders? Parents, school, policymakers, community. What would you recommend? How can we approach it in a systematic way and deliver our message?
So the first thing that you need to do is do a little bit of stakeholder mapping and try to think about, okay, who needs to hear this particular message? Who needs to know about it? Is it policymakers? Do we need a new policy in terms of absenteeism? Is it schools and teachers? Or is it parents? Or is it all of those people? Who are my stakeholders in this? All of them. Then you are going to, and the community. Then what you actually are going to have to do is develop quite a complex strategy in which you have different routes of dissemination to those different groups. Because the way that you reach teachers and schools, the language that you use is not the same as you would with parents, community, with politicians. So this does become quite a complex picture. So you're going to have a number of different pillars to your dissemination strategy. So for example, when you are talking to policymakers, what you need is, first of all, try to make the connections. Who are the people that matter in this particular area? And often the people to go to are the civil servants rather than the politicians themselves, because they do the day-to-day enactment of the policy. So get to know who those are, and then present them with the information in as clear and succinct a way possible. Because what policy makers do not do is read journal articles or stuff like that. You need to kind of have a brief précis, a brief summary. When I worked in the civil servants, I found that most of the way of communication was via PowerPoint slide packs. So certainly keep it simple. If you are looking at communities, then of course you have two different, again, you need to think, am I looking at particular communities around the school, or am I looking at the general public? If you are looking at the general public, it sounds old-fashioned, but still one of the best ways to do that is via the mainstream media and getting your research out in the television, the newspapers, etc. Often now it's said people get most of their news through social media. That is largely true, especially for the younger people, but a lot of what comes on social media is stuff that is picked up first from various mainstream media. So it's a good way in, and it's easier to get a lot of people to access something through that route than to try and build up virality through social media. That's complicated. So that would be, so different strategies for different groups. And I know I'm maybe talking too long now.
So now it's time to thank you again,
No problem.
Dr.